It started as a small, almost laughable observation. The lights in Mr. Grayson's house were always on. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he worked late hours or had trouble sleeping. But as the weeks turned into months, the neighbors of Maplewood Lane began to notice more. It wasn't just the lights. Mr. Grayson himself was always awake, always watching. I remember the first time I noticed him. It was late, well past midnight, and I was taking out the trash. His house was at the corner of the street, and as I glanced over, I saw him standing by his window. He wasn't doing anything, just staring out into the darkness. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the dimmed glow of his living room light. I waved, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. At the time, I brushed it off. Maybe he didn't see me. Maybe he was lost in thought. But as the days went by, I started to see him more and more. Every time I looked out my window, there he was, standing in the same spot, staring out at the street. It wasn't long before the rest of the neighborhood started talking about him. Mrs. Carter, who lived directly across from Mr. Grayson, was the first to bring it up. "Have you noticed how he's always awake?" she asked me one morning as we stood by the mailbox. "I don't think I've ever seen his house dark. It's strange." Others began to chime in. Mr. Thompson, who lived 2 doors down, said he'd seen Mr. Boss Grayson standing in his yard late at night. "He wasn't doing anything," Mr. Thompson said, his voice low. "Just standing there, looking at my house. It gave me the creeps." The children in the neighborhood started making up stories about him. They called him the Watcher and dared each other to run up to his porch and knock on his door. None of them ever did. Things took a darker turn when Mr. Thompson's dog, Max, went missing. Max was a friendly golden retriever who loved everyone. But one night, he simply vanished. Mr. Thompson was devastated. He put up flyers, knocked on doors, and even called the local animal shelter, but there was no sign of Max. A few days later, Mr. Thompson installed a security camera in his backyard. "Just in case," he said. The footage he captured was chilling. In the dead of night, Mr. Grayson could be seen walking through Mr. Thompson's yard. He wasn't doing anything, just walking slowly, his head turning as if he were looking for something. He stopped by the back door, stood there for a few minutes, and then walked away. When Mr. Thompson showed the footage to the rest of us, we were horrified. Why was Mr. Grayson wandering through people's yards in the middle of the night, and what had happened to Max? A group of us decided to confront him. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we gathered outside his house. Mrs. Carter knocked on the door, her hand trembling slightly. When Mr. Grayson opened the door, he looked normal. He was wearing a sweater and jeans, and his expression was calm, almost friendly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice soft. Mrs. Carter cleared her throat. "We've noticed some strange things," she said. "You've been walking through people's yards at night, and Max, Mr. Thompson's dog, he's missing. Do you know anything about that?" Mr. Grayson's smile didn't falter. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I don't go out at night. I'm just a light sleeper, that's all." His calm demeanor was unnerving. We didn't know what to say. After a few moments of awkward silence, we left. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the truth finally came out. A new family had moved into the house next to Mr. Grayson's, and their teenage son, Jake, was curious about the strange man everyone was talking about. One night, Jake climbed the tree in his backyard, which gave him a clear view into Mr. Grayson's basement window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside the basement were mannequins, dozens of them. They were dressed in clothes that looked eerily familiar. One was wearing a scarf that Mrs. Carter had lost months ago. Another had a hat that belonged to Mr. Thompson. But it wasn't just the clothes. The mannequins were posed as if they were alive, frozen in mid-conversation or laughter. Jake climbed down from the tree and ran to tell his parents. They called the police, who arrived the next morning with a search warrant. What the police found in Mr. Grayson's basement was worse than any of us could have imagined. The mannequins were just the beginning. Behind a false wall, they discovered a collection of photographs, hundreds of them. The photos were of us. They showed our houses, our yards, and even the insides of our homes. Some were taken from a distance, but others were disturbingly close, as if Mr. Grayson had been inside while we were sleeping. There were also items that had gone missing over the years: a child's toy, a pair of gloves, a garden gnome, And then there were the bones. In a small locked box, the police found the remains of several animals, including a dog. DNA testing confirmed that one of them was Max. Mr. Grayson was arrested that afternoon. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. As the police led him away, he turned to look at us, his expression calm. "I just wanted to be part of your lives," he said. The neighborhood was never the same after that. People installed security cameras and motion sensor lights. Some even moved away, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. As for me, I still live on Maplewood Lane. But every night before I go to bed, I check my windows and lock my doors. And sometimes, when I'm lying in the dark, I can't help but wonder, was Mr. Grayson the only one? Or is there someone else out there, watching, waiting? One thing is certain, I'll never forget the neighbor who never slept. When I first moved into this apartment building, everything seemed perfect. A quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, a clean stairwell. My apartment was small but cozy, exactly what I needed after a long and exhausting life in the city. I was excited to start fresh, to finally have a place I could call home. But soon, I realized that these walls hid more than I could have ever imagined. It all started with small things. My neighbor to the left, Mr. Jonas, was a quiet and reserved man. He rarely left his apartment, and when he did, he always seemed to be in a hurry, as if he didn't want anyone to notice him. His door was always locked, and his windows were covered with thick curtains, even during the day. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone has their quirks, right? Maybe he was just a private person. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice more. The hallway outside his door always had a faint, unpleasant smell. It wasn't strong, but it lingered, something between dampness and decay. Then came the noises. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible. I would hear them late at night when the building was quiet. It sounded like whispers, muffled and distant, coming from the wall we shared. I told myself it was probably just the TV or a radio. But the more I listened, the more unsettling it became. The whispers didn't sound like a TV show. They sounded like someone crying, pleading. One night, the noises became louder. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard it again. A woman's voice, muffled but desperate. She was crying, and then I heard what sounded like a thud, followed by silence. My heart raced. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more, but the noises didn't return that night. The next morning, I ran into Mr. Jonas in the stairwell. He was carrying a bag of groceries, his head down as usual. I tried to make small talk, asking him how he was doing, but he barely acknowledged me. He muttered something under his breath and hurried past me, disappearing into his apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The noises, the smell, his strange behavior, it all added up to something I couldn't ignore. But what could I do? I didn't have any proof that anything was actually happening. A few days later, the smell in the hallway grew stronger. It was no longer faint, it was overwhelming. It hit me as soon as I stepped out of my apartment. It was a sickly, rotting smell that made my stomach turn. I covered my nose and looked toward Mr. Jonas's door. The smell was definitely coming from there. I stood there for a moment, debating what to do. Should I knock on his door? Should I call someone? I didn't want to overreact, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to knock. My hand trembled as I raised it to the door. I knocked 3 times, loud enough to be heard. There was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear any movement inside, but all I could hear was silence. I went back to my apartment, my mind racing. What was going on in there? That night, the noises returned. This time they were louder than ever. I could hear the woman's voice again, crying out, but her words were still muffled. Then I heard a loud crash, like something heavy falling to the floor. My heart was pounding. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. I felt a pang of guilt as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. What if I was wrong? What if it was nothing? But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining things. When the police arrived, I met them in the hallway. I explained everything. The noises, the smell, Mr. Jonas's strange behavior. They knocked on his door, announcing themselves, but there was no answer. After a few minutes, they decided to break the door down. What they found inside will haunt me forever. The apartment was dark and filthy. The windows were covered with blackout curtains, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The officers moved cautiously through the rooms, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. In the bedroom, they found her. A woman, tied to the bed, her face pale and gaunt. She was alive, but barely. She had been missing for months, and Mr. Jonas had been keeping her captive in his apartment. The officers called for an ambulance, and she was rushed to the hospital. Mr. Jonas was nowhere to be found. He had fled before the police arrived, but they assured me they would find him. The days that followed were a blur. The building was swarming with police and reporters. Neighbors gathered in the hallway, whispering in shock and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could we have lived next to such horror and not known? I couldn't stop thinking about the noises, the whispers I had heard through the wall. They had been cries for help, and I had ignored them for weeks. The guilt was overwhelming. I learned later that the woman had been abducted by Mr. Jonas months earlier. He had kept her locked in his apartment, abusing her and keeping her hidden from the world. The smell in the hallway had come from the food he had left to rot, and the noises I had heard were her desperate attempts to be heard. This experience changed me forever. It made me realize how often we ignore the signs of something wrong because we don't want to get involved. We tell ourselves it's none of our business, that it's probably nothing. But sometimes those small signs, the strange smells, the odd noises, the unusual behavior, are warnings we can't afford to ignore. Now, I pay closer attention to the people around me. I listen more carefully. And if something feels off, I don't hesitate to act. Because sometimes, behind the walls that seem so ordinary, there's a story of terror waiting to be uncovered. The walls that whisper always have something to say.